A great number of writers quote Weber. I think most of them misquote Weber, and in fact, I'm going to show that Weber actually defines an insurgency. What's surprising to me is lots of writers seem to forget the state of Germany in 1919, um, and who exactly Weber's audience was. So, who exactly was he writing to, and why? Here's the quote that I most take issue with, and we're going to break it down in the next few slides. Above all, through the opening of this essay, and in this quote in particular, Weber makes clear that he does not understand the concepts of legitimacy and legality. He overly focuses on legitimacy, which is a popular concept, and it's just part of a state. It is not the whole state. Second, he talks about this so-called right to violence. Well, that's not really the issue for a state. A state is there to prohibit violence. And so an individual is ultimately responsible, and in any and all cases, a state will determine the rightness after the fact. That's whether it was a civilian, a soldier, or a police officer. All of these, there is no, the right is determined after the fact, not before. So what he's talking about basically doesn't exist. And as I said before, the state prohibits violence. It's not a monopoly on violence, it's a monopoly on peace. And so, in essence, Weber here is using loaded, what we might refer to as gang language today. And for those of you who know your history, you can probably see where this is going. Think about 1918, 1919, post World War I Germany, and see if you can think of what one thing you're taught in your history classes that comes immediately to mind. Now, to look a little bit more closely with this, legitimacy and legality are two important concepts, but they're completely different. You've got to keep that in mind. Now, Yablonsky, in another book that I would highly recommend called The Violent Gang, identifies four separate categories, sort of playing against legality and legitimacy. Um, I'm not going to go into them here, but keep in mind that you have legal, sanctioned, rational, illegal, sanctioned, rational, and then illegal, non-sanctioned, rational. So if it's sanctioned, that's legitimate. If it's legal and it's illegal. So you actually have this interplay in enforcement that then gets determined after the fact. And Weber just does not even come close to addressing this fact in his definition. This is another thing that really irks me about Weber. He somehow misses the fact, despite this is 1918, 1919 Germany, that anybody who wants to literally goes out and asserts the quote, the right to violence. And it just completely baffles me. Like, this is not how a state actually works. The state is there to suppress that and prevent that, not to sort of uh, press a right or assert a right. And so the state, in its proper form, only responds after an individual, not before. And how Weber seems to miss this in his definition just baffles me. This particular phrasing by Weber here makes me think of what we sometimes hear of as green lighting. And again, this is not something a state does. This is something a criminal leader does to permit, to offer a green light, to open a contract, to however you want to put it. And this is the exact opposite of what a state actually does. A state prohibits, it does not permit. And where he's getting this phrasing from, I still don't understand. But the only way to understand it is to realize this was 1918, 1919, post World War I Germany, which is full of insurgencies. This is another major point with Weber's definition. He expressly, through his own definition, is only referring to one level of law, when in fact there are three levels of law. If anybody who looks even just briefly at an introductory textbook, criminal law, civil law, and what I'm calling canon law. So you have the criminal law where you might have the state might react with violence of its own if that's deemed reasonable. But then you have civil, this whole fray or whole field of civil law, which involves two disputing parties in a nonviolent way. And that has been a major part of law for a very long time, since the Romans, quite, I mean, and before them as well. And then for those of you not overly familiar with canon law, this is what I'm referring to as, I guess, organizational policy. So a good example would be the state will never control the recipe. The state will only that a restaurant is making. They are only interested that the food is prepared in a safe manner. And then if it's unsafe, it's probably still just going to be a civil matter, not a criminal matter. And so this whole depth of a state is completely lacking in Weber's definition from the very get-go. And I believe he's doing this willingly too. He knows this, but he's not saying it for. And why is he not saying it? Unlike Clausewitz, Weber is equivocating violence with politics. Clausewitz, as you all know, is one that famously said violence is politics by other means. Weber sees them as one and the same. So in this passage, we begin to see a sort of Machiavellian uh, approach to politics, if it is even political. And you got to keep in mind, remind you once again that this essay was published in 1919 at the height of the insurgencies, well, at the beginning of the insurgencies in Germany that would eventually lead us into World War II. And the essay makes no bones about it on page 35, talking about vocation, even using the word gang leader at some point. And we have Weber here justifying Germany's actions in World War One. At no point in this introduction, the first 3 pages of the essay, is he remotely concerned with the idea of the balance of power as we understand, in America today, between judicial, executive, and legislative. He's just not even interested. I genuinely wonder if any of the professors who use uh, Weber's definition of a state have read this statement within, again, on page 34, that's in the beginning of the essay. I mean, how do you square this with your supposed idea of the state? It's completely missing the idea of what Weber's getting across. So, for those of you who maybe aren't as familiar with the history, you keep in mind there's this thing called the Freikorps. Well, one of the groups was called the Freikorps, and this the whole idea of paramilitary politics in Weimar Germany was a major, major issue, and it was more than just the Freikorps. But Germany was awash in these many varied insurgencies post World War One. I mean, these militant groups, and I recommend you go look at the Wikipedia page because there were plenty of them. And you got to understand that the state, if Weber was concerned with the state, he'd be concerned about containing and preventing the violence from these groups, not encouraging it. His definition shows no interest in that. So this is where Weber has no interest in what he says he's doing. So here, what can we obviously conclude from these first 4 or 5 pages from uh, Politics as a Vocation? Weber, in so many words, claims the state is one and the same as a popular charismatic leader. Or in the essay's own terms, the state is the vocation of the charismatic leader. Now, I'm not sure you're all up in your World War II history, but see where this ends up in the 1930s and the late 30s. Um, there you go. Go read your history.